Are you ready to dive into the unknown? In today's video, we're uncovering 7 spine-chilling true ghost stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. Grab your flashlight and prepare for a journey into the supernatural, because you won't want to miss these terrifying tales. Sarah made the decision to stay in her comfortable apartment on New Year's Eve rather than going out. Although the city was bustling with festivities, she took comfort in the glow of her TV and the soft hum of her heater. When 11:55 p.m. rolled around, she made the decision to watch an old film. A shadowy figure came and stared directly at her when the television briefly flickered and displayed static. Unable to process what she was seeing, she froze. Her apartment became completely dark as the electricity went out. The faint whisper of her name was the only sound. She went to the door and grabbed her phone for brightness. There was nobody there when she opened it. However, she sensed a chilly breath on her neck from behind. Her phone's light illuminated an empty room as she spun around. Her breath was short and her heart was racing. The flat, which had been a comfortable place, suddenly felt like a trap. "Who is present?" Sarah's voice was shaking as she called out. She received silence in response, but the suffocating sense of being watched intensified. Locking the door behind her, she rushed back to the living room. Her phone said, "No service," when she attempted to call a buddy. She was completely alone, or so she believed, and panic struck. This time, the whisper started out soft and incomprehensible before becoming louder. The television, which was still off, appeared to be the source of it. She quickly glanced at the TV when it abruptly came back to life and revealed the dark figure. The figure drew nearer this time, its form more distinct. It had eyes that gleamed a faint crimson, and it was towering and dark. The voice sent shivers down her spine as it growled, "Sarah." She bumped into the coffee table as she retreated. With its long, claw-like fingers, the figure's hand appeared to extend from the screen. Sarah reached for the closest object, a glass vase, and threw it at the TV in desperation. The room fell back into darkness when the screen broke. There was silence for a while. Then the apartment echoed with a low, guttural snarl. It wasn't finished. She staggered into her bedroom, pushed a furniture in front of it, and slammed the door. She fumbled for something to use as a weapon, her hands shaking. She located some scissors and gripped them firmly. She was left in full darkness when the flashlight on her phone flickered and ultimately died. Slow, purposeful footfall, now followed by an increasing grumble. They paused outside the door of her bedroom. With a voice full of hate, it called again, "Sarah." In the hopes that it would pass, she held her breath. The door handle turned after jiggling. As though testing its weight, the dresser she had put against the door creaked. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice cracking. The door stopped being pressed. There was silence for a while. Then, like claws dragging down the wooden surface, a scraping sound began on the opposite side. The whispers suddenly came back, but this time they were coming from inside the room. Overlapping and intensifying until they were deafening, they whirled about her. With tears running down her cheeks, Sarah closed her ears. Her breath could be seen in the dim light from the street lamp outside her window as the air became frigid. She popped the window in a desperate attempt to get out on the fire escape. A skeletal, chilly hand caught her wrist as she reached out. With a scream, she retreated as hard as she could. She was let go by the hand and collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. She glanced up to see the person standing there, completely risen from the darkness. Its eyes were brighter, its face a hideous mask of rot. Then she choked out, "Why?" As though delighted, the creature cocked its head. In a voice that seemed to reverberate from the depths of space, it said, "You invited me." "No, I didn't," she whimpered. "I don't even know you," and backed up till her back against the wall. A split piece of paper was visible when the figure held out a hand. Sarah wrote, "I wish I wasn't alone tonight," in her handwriting. She recalled writing it down in her journal earlier that night, a quick idea she hadn't given any consideration to. "The power of words," the person muttered. "I came when you called." She shook her head, her eyesight distorted by tears. "I didn't mean it. Just leave me alone, please." The presence of the looming apparition was oppressive. It growled. "An invitation cannot be withdrawn." Sarah gathered all her strength and swung the scissors forward, aiming for the figure's chest. They struck, but they passed through empty air rather than cutting flesh. After dissolving into smoke, the creature reformed behind her. Its cold touch caught hold of her shoulder. It said, "Your soul is mine," and drew her in as the darkness started to encircle them. "No," Sarah thrashed and kicked as she yelled. On the floor, she noticed her journal, the shredded page glimmering dimly. She snatched it up with her free hand and yelled, "I take it back." I retract it. The figure flinched, its hold slipping. The room was filled with dazzling light as the glow from the page grew stronger. As the form broke apart and the shadows retreated into emptiness, the whispers became screams. Sarah was alone when the light went out. Her phone buzzed back to life and the temperature stabilized. Holding the journal to her chest, she let out a sigh of relief. The air was filled with the distant boom of fireworks when the clock struck midnight. Sarah leaned against the wall, exhausted, with her thoughts racing. She was aware that she had just barely avoided loneliness. She ripped out the pages of her journal where she had written random ideas and burned them in the kitchen sink while she turned through the remaining pages. Sarah never again jotted down her ephemeral wishes after that night. She came to the conclusion that some doors were better left unopened. A strange incident occurred a few days before New Year's Eve, in the center of a sleepy, charming town surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. The residents of the town, who had long been used to the steady rhythm of their calm existence, became suddenly disturbed. One morning, an old clock loomed towering and scary in the town center. Nobody could recall when it had come or who had put it there, but it was there. It was a unique clock, with a brass face that shone in the sunlight and was engraved with elaborate patterns that appeared to alter with the light. But what was most disturbing were its hands. They took a step back. People initially dismissed it as a strange occurrence, but it quickly became apparent that this clock was not like others. The hands mocked the passage of time by continuing their reverse march as the days went by, ticking backward through the hours. While some chose to ignore it, others congregated in whispered groups to speculate about its source. Rain and snow brushed off the clock's gleaming surface, as though it were impervious to the changing of the seasons. The town was a hive of activity on the morning of New Year's Eve. While parents made last-minute preparations for the celebration that evening, children rushed around the streets, excitedly anticipating the celebrations. There was a certain nervousness in the air, despite the happiness, as though everyone knew something was going to happen. Everyone was on edge because of the clock, which had become into a local mystery. It loomed large over the town's festivities, standing in the square like an unexpected visitor. The whole town had assembled in the square at twilight. With its backward-moving hands approaching midnight, the clock loomed over them. Many of the people in the throng exchanged anxious looks as they stood in anticipation. What was the meaning of this clock? Everyone knew that midnight would fall tonight, but nobody had any answers. The chilly wind started to stir as the year's last seconds passed. A feeling of fear spread across the throng as the temperature dropped. The hands of the clock, now uncannily near 12, jerked backward one last time. When the clock struck 13, everyone in the crowd held their breath. The chime's voice echoed across the town with a profound, unearthly resonance that seemed to emanate from the Earth's very core. Time itself seems to shake. Once only a breeze, the wind became a ferocious gale that whipped through the streets and stirred the leaves in the trees. The town was engulfed in a suffocating cloud as a dense fog started to drift in, seemingly called by an invisible force. Then something really horrible occurred. The crowd let out a piercing gasp, and then there was a chorus of screaming. The familiar silhouettes of the individuals that had always adhered to their sides, the shadows of the people, started to move on their own. It was faint at first, a flicker in the shadows. Then, however, the shadows grew longer and more warped, stretching and writhing as if they had grown into separate entities. A few of the villagers attempted to retreat, but their shadows moved more quickly. They sprang forward, relentlessly dragging their owners in the direction of the clock. The square was filled with screams as people tried in vain to escape. They were drawn closer and closer to the towering clock as the shadows held them with a cold, iron-like strength. The face of the clock appeared to glow with an extraordinary light, and the numbers danced wildly as though they were living things as well. Despite their desperate attempts to flee, the crowd's panic simply strengthened the attraction. An energy seemed to permeate the air as the clock's hands, now set at 13, pulsed. The clock appeared to be a portal to an unearthly dimension. As though it were living, people were drawn toward the vortex that had formed in the middle of the clock's dial, and they were dragged into its face, one by one. They were swallowed completely by the spinning whirlpool of light and shadow. The scene was a blur of terror and confusion. Some people tried to flee, while others screamed for help, but nobody was able to save them. The air itself seemed to be thick with evil power. The clock, with its frozen hands, stood motionless in the middle of the chaos, its gaping mouth devouring the town's residents. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The eerie wind died down, and the clock's chimes stopped. The only sound of the last few footsteps of those who had fled into the fog was heard in the distance. By the time the fog cleared, the town was empty, and not a soul was left in the square. The streets were curiously quiet, the residences deserted, the shops locked. The town appeared to have vanished off the face of the earth. The clock was all that was left, towering and motionless, a somber reminder of the atrocities that had taken place. Its hands were frozen at 13. As if time itself had been tainted, the clock's once beautiful brass face had become tarnished and drab. No one ever mentioned the town again, but the clock remained in the plaza, its hands frozen at 13, waiting for the next unwary victim to fall into its twisted clutches. The legend of the clock grew over the years, and the town itself gradually faded into memory, its name forgotten, its history erased, until only the clock remained, standing as a dark sentinel in the town square, forever frozen at 13. It was said that on quiet nights, when the moon was full and the wind whispered through the trees, you could hear the faint sound of chimes in the distance, ringing out the hour that should never have been. However, no one in the surrounding towns dared venture near because they had heard the stories, told in whispered tones around campfires, about the strange clock that stole time itself, and the people who disappeared without a trace. The final destination of those who were hauled inside the clock was never questioned. There were many who claimed to have been imprisoned in a separate dimension where time did not exist. Others said they had been transported to a shadowy realm and would never be able to return. However, the reality remained a mystery, much like the chimes of the clock. As a reminder of the impermanent nature of time and the catastrophic consequences of tampering with powers beyond our comprehension, the clock continued to strike 13. The office was eerie as Lisa sat slumped in her chair, staring blankly at her computer's glowing screen. Her co-workers had long since left to celebrate the new year with friends and family, so she was left to finish the last few calls of the night. It wasn't the best way to start the new year, but she needed the overtime. As Lisa typed notes into the call center system, the only sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent lights above. She looked up at the clock. Just 2 minutes left, she thought. The excitement of the holiday had been replaced by an awkward silence, and the monotony was broken by a sharp ringing phone. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Call center. How may I assist you?" she answered, her voice sounding flat and tired. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted, the words coming through as if submerged underwater. It was faint, yet urgent. "Check the back room." Lisa's brows furrowed. The back room? There was nothing back there but old files, broken equipment, and dusty cardboard boxes. It was more of a storage space than a room anyone would ever need to visit, especially on a quiet night like this. I think you've got the wrong number, Lisa replied, rolling her eyes and preparing to hang up. But she was stopped by something in the voice's tone. It had an unusual tightness, a weight that was alien. The voice seemed to be diminishing, as though the caller was about to vanish. Lisa's fingers lingered over the phone as she paused. The voice continued, more urgently this time. Check the back room. As though it knew something she didn't, a shiver went through her body. The temperature in the office dropped mysteriously and the air felt abruptly colder. All day, the heater had been operating without any issues. Nevertheless, a strange, invisible cold appeared to settle over the room at this precise instant. Lisa looked at the clock, 11:59 p.m. Who is this? She said, her voice wavering slightly. Static was all that was heard. Before the call ended abruptly, there was still a period of stillness. Lisa sat motionless, gazing at the phone she was holding. The hair on the back of her neck stood on edge, and her heart pounded. Trying to tell herself it had all been a joke, she shook her head. There was no cause for fear. After all, the back room was really a storage space. There's nothing to be concerned about. But she suffered by an unusual need. The call had a strange, disturbing quality. She had never encountered a prank like this before. She put the phone down without thinking and got to her feet, her legs feeling heavier than normal. She needed to look into the back room. She felt as though she had no other option, even though there was no rational reason to. The sole source of light in the dimly lit hallway going to the back room was the distant glow from her computer screen. Before entering the hallway, she fumbled for and turned on the flashlight on her desk. Long, shaky shadows were created along the walls by the flickering light. The stifling silence pressed down on Lisa as she walked into the rear room, her footsteps resonating loudly in the deserted office. She halted as she got to the door. Although the door was open, the room outside was extremely cold and dark. She had the unshakable impression that someone or something was waiting for her inside. She inhaled deeply before creaking the door open. The chill seeped into her skin like ice water from the freezing air inside. She shone the lamp around while shivering. Old filing cabinets filled the area, their metal surfaces covered with cobwebs and filth. Unused and forgotten, broken office equipment was scattered about in corners. But then someone, was illuminated by her light. A stooped person stood at the window in the far corner of the room. It appeared to be a person at first, but the shape was distorted and strange. It appeared to have been crouching for hours because of the strange angle at which it was bowed. Lisa heard faint, garbled whispers coming from the direction of the figure's lowered head. Her throat tightened each breath. The whispers increased louder and louder until they sounded like pained cries with an increasing pitch. It was an attack on her senses, an intolerable sound. Who are you? Lisa's voice trembled as she asked. She was immobile, unable to move, even though she longed to run. The head snapped upward as the figure jerked. Lisa's flashlight beam flickered erratically as she screamed and staggered backward. The figure's mouth was open in a mute scream. Its face twisted in a hideous look. Only the frenzied rush of blood thumping in her ears was audible. The room suddenly fell silent once more. The figure has vanished. Lisa blinked with confusion. She flicked the spotlight around frantically, but the room was empty. Empty, empty. Her mind was having trouble processing what had just transpired, and her heart was thumping in her chest. She could barely breathe since the room's air felt heavy and thick. Then she noticed something. There was a crumpled piece of paper on the floor, right in front of where the figure had been standing. She dropped to her knees and grabbed it up, her fingers shaking. Written in a hasty, ragged script, the note was straightforward. You shouldn't have come. Lisa felt her gut lurch. The note weighed heavily on her as she got to her feet. She staggered back toward the door as a wave of vertigo swept over her. She needed to leave that place. She had to go. A loud boom echoed behind her as she turned to run. She turned, but nothing was there. No sound, no person. There was silence in the room. However, the noises started up again, first softly and then louder and louder. Lisa's heart raced. She couldn't stay here any longer, but she had no idea what was going on. The cold air chased her as she ran back to her desk after leaving the room. As she picked up her luggage and got ready to go, her hands were trembling. The wall clock struck midnight. Her phone rang abruptly once again. Lisa paused and gazed at the television. The number was identical to the previous one. She answered, her hands trembling. This voice was distorted, asking, "Did you check the back room?" With her heart thumping in her ears, Lisa slapped the phone down. She was unable to be here any longer. Her legs were wobbly under her as she hurried to the door. With each step she took, the walls of the structure appeared to close in on her. The call center's clock seemed to chime one last time as she stepped outside into the night air. Then there was silence.